The lights in the recreation hall dimmed as the projector hummed to life on that September evening in 1945. 500 German prisoners settled into their seats at Camp Deming, New Mexico, ready to lose themselves in the flickering images of a Western. Cowboys and bandits played out their timeless drama across the screen, and laughter rippled through the darkness. But not everyone was watching. Georg Gertner sat motionless in the shadows, his attention fixed on something far more urgent than Hollywood's latest offering. His eyes kept drifting toward the clock on the wall. He was counting down the minutes with the intensity of a man whose life hung in the balance. At precisely 8:47 that evening, a westbound freight train would approach the curve just beyond the camp's outer fence. For 3 weeks, he had monitored that train's schedule with the discipline of a military campaign, noting every detail, every deviation, every possibility. While his fellow prisoners were absorbed in celluloid fantasies, Gertner was preparing to do something only a handful of other prisoners had attempted. He was going to escape, but this wasn't a desperate bid to rejoin the fighting or satisfy an ache for home. His reasons ran deeper, darker. In his pocket lay a letter from the International Red Cross, delivered 6 weeks earlier. The words on that page had rewritten his entire world. His hometown of Schweidnitz in Lower Silesia no longer existed as part of Germany. The Soviets had claimed it and handed it over to Poland. What that meant for German families, there was no mystery. Expulsion, imprisonment, death. For men like Gertner, whose homes now lay beyond the Iron Curtain, America represented something far more valuable than freedom. It meant survival. The gunfire from the screen flickered across the room as Gertner slipped from his seat. He moved quietly, deliberately, leaving the recreation hall behind. Once outside, he crawled beneath the perimeter gates, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the distance, a whistle pierced the desert air. The freight train was coming. He had 90 seconds to cover 200 yards of open ground, reach the moving train, and vanish into an America that had become more precious to him than the Germany he had known. His journey to that desperate night in the New Mexico desert had begun decades earlier. Georg Gertner was born on December 18, 1920, in Schweidnitz, a prosperous textile center nestled in the shadow of the Sudeten Mountains. The town thrived, and his family thrived with it. His father managed a local brewery, a position that secured them solid middle-class comfort, the kind of security that would later seem like impossible luxury as the world fell apart around them. The young Gertner showed genuine talent for languages. At the gymnasium, he mastered English and French with ease, skills that would ultimately prove more valuable than any military training could ever provide. When war erupted in September of 1939, 19-year-old Gertner felt the pull of nationalism along with his entire generation. He enlisted in the Wehrmacht, caught up in the fervor that promised to restore Germany's greatness and reshape Europe. The 10th Panzer Division became his assignment, and with it came the rush of those early victories. France fell in 1940, and Gertner raced through the Ardennes with thousands of others, reaching the English Channel in just 6 weeks. Everything Nazi propaganda had promised seemed to be coming true. German superiority was real. Allied weakness was visible. Invincibility was within grasp. But by February 1941, Gertner found himself aboard a transport ship crossing the Mediterranean toward Tripoli. He was heading to Libya to join Erwin Rommel's newly formed Afrika Korps. The Desert War would shatter every illusion he carried with him. The reality of North Africa struck hard. The Afrika Korps, numbering just 2 divisions at its inception, faced the entire assembled resources of the British Empire. German soldiers rationed their water to a single liter each day, while temperatures soared past 120 degrees. Yet they captured British supply dumps brimming with tinned peaches, chocolate, cigarettes, and rum. Those luxuries told a story that propaganda couldn't explain away. Their enemy possessed material advantages that seemed almost incomprehensible. The mathematics of desert warfare revealed truths that no official bulletin could conceal. A single Tiger tank consumed 600 liters of fuel to travel 100 kilometers. The Afrika Korps' entire fuel allocation for March 1942 would have supplied Patton's Third Army for merely 3 days. German soldiers whispered bitter jokes about Rommel's tactical genius, being forced to win battles with equipment held together by wire and sheer willpower. Gertner rose through the ranks to sergeant in the 164th Light Africa Division, leading reconnaissance units that probed British lines ahead of major offensives. At El Alamein in October 1942, his unit watched helplessly as Montgomery's forces unleashed something almost biblical in scale. 1,000 guns opened fire simultaneously. The artillery barrage contained more firepower than the entire Afrika Korps possessed. 15,000 shells fell in that opening bombardment alone, while German artillery faced strict rationing of just 10 shells per gun each day. The retreat from El Alamein became a 1,400-mile nightmare across the North African landscape. Gertner's unit abandoned vehicles starved of fuel, destroyed equipment they couldn't carry, and watched the Luftwaffe vanish from African skies as Allied air superiority became total and absolute. By January 1943, the Afrika Korps had been compressed into a rapidly shrinking pocket in Tunisia, surrounded by American forces that had landed during Operation Torch. The final collapse came in May 1943 in an olive grove outside Tunis. Gertner's reconnaissance unit, reduced from 120 men to just 17, had run out of ammunition, fuel, and any remaining hope. British soldiers from the 8th Army surrounded their position as the entire Axis collapse in Tunisia unfolded around them. Within days, 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered. Gertner raised a white undershirt tied to a rifle barrel. The British soldiers seemed almost uncomfortable accepting the surrender, offering cigarettes and chocolate to men who looked more like scarecrows than soldiers. The temporary prison camp outside Matai introduced Gertner to American organizational power that exceeded anything in his military experience. Within 48 hours, the United States Army had erected a tent city housing 30,000 prisoners. Field hospitals rose alongside mess tents and latrines. Every prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned identification tags with assembly line precision. It was efficiency on a scale Germany could never match. Then came the food. After months of surviving on hard biscuits and sardines, the prisoners received rations that even American soldiers complained about. But to Germans who had grown accustomed to deprivation, these meals seemed like feasts. Canned beef, crackers, chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes appeared in quantities that seemed almost insulting in their abundance. Gertner watched guards casually discard half-eaten meals that would have sustained his entire unit for days. When he mentioned this waste to a young guard from Iowa, the GI simply shrugged. "Don't worry about it. We got plenty more where that came from." The USS Samuel Huntington, a Liberty ship that would carry Gertner across the Atlantic, represented American industrial might in its most tangible form. Built at the California Shipbuilding Corporation in Wilmington in just 44 days, it was one of 2,700 identical vessels America would produce during the war. The ship's galley served fresh bread baked daily, powdered eggs that actually tasted like real eggs, and coffee so plentiful that sailors poured leftover pots directly overboard into the ocean. During the 14-day crossing in July 1943, Gertner's English abilities earned him a position assisting with prisoner administration. This access granted him a glimpse of technology that Germany had barely begun to develop. From the ship's bridge, he observed radar equipment tracking other vessels beyond the visible horizon. The medical bay contained medicines and pharmaceuticals that German field hospitals hadn't seen since 1941, including the new miracle drug penicillin that Americans distributed almost casually. What troubled Gertner most was the American attitude toward material wealth. Sailors threw away magazines after reading them once. They discarded barely worn shoes. They gambled away monthly wages that exceeded what German officers earned in an entire year. When Gertner asked a bosun's mate about such casual waste, the sailor simply laughed. "Hell, friend, America makes more in a day than we can throw away in a month." On July 24, 1943, the Samuel Huntington entered Hampton Roads at Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. Gertner counted the vessels clustered throughout the harbor. 47 cargo ships, 12 destroyers, 3 aircraft carriers in various stages of construction or repair. The new port's shipbuilding yards stretched for 3 miles along the James River, their enormous cranes operating around the clock beneath blazing electric lights. Prisoners marched past parking lots containing hundreds of private automobiles, vehicles owned by ordinary shipyard workers. In Germany, private car ownership remained a fantasy, accessible only to party elite. Here, workers and riveters drove themselves to work in their own cars. Help-wanted signs advertised wages that seemed absolutely impossible. Skilled workers earned $1.20 per hour, figures that would have staggered German laborers. Nothing prepared Gertner for the actual train journey inland. Instead of cattle cars used for transporting German troops, the prisoners boarded genuine Pullman coaches with cushioned seats, overhead luggage racks, and electric fans. The dining car served hot meals on actual plates using metal cutlery, treatment better than German officers received on their troop trains. Air conditioning maintained comfortable temperatures despite the July heat. This technology existed only in Hitler's personal railway car back home. As the train rolled through Virginia's Tidewater region, Gertner pressed his face against the window. Every small town blazed with electric lights even at 10 o'clock at night. Martinsville's Main Street displayed illuminated shop windows overflowing with merchandise. Roanoke's rail yards operated beneath banks of floodlights that transformed night into day. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged cities into complete darkness since 1940. Here, light was so abundant it was treated as disposable. At Charlottesville, the train stopped for water and coal. Gertner watched American efficiency in action. Automated coal loaders filled the tender in 20 minutes, a task requiring 2 hours of manual labor in Germany. Railroad workers wore leather boots and denim overalls that would have cost a German laborer 3 months' wages. They drank Coca-Cola from glass bottles and casually tossed the empties into recycling bins, treating as trash what would have been treasured in wartime Germany. As the train crossed into Tennessee, Gertner encountered American industrial power on a scale that defied comprehension. Outside Kingsport, the Tennessee Eastman Chemical Complex sprawled across the landscape. Its cooling towers and distillation columns stretched for 2 miles. Through Kentucky's coal country, endless freight trains paralleled the passenger line, all hauling coal from Appalachian mines. Gertner counted 147 cars in a single coal train, each carrying 100 tons, pulled by locomotives that dwarfed anything in European railways. Near Louisville, the prisoners glimpsed the rubber town complex. 4 massive synthetic rubber plants had risen from empty fields in just 18 months, producing 800,000 tons annually, using processes German chemists had invented, but never scaled to such magnitude. Germany, at its absolute peak, had managed barely 120,000 tons. The psychological weight accumulated with each mile westward. In St. Louis, they crossed the Mississippi River while watching barges below carry more grain than Germany's entire 1942 harvest. The rail yards extended for 8 miles along the riverfront, with grain elevators capable of storing enough wheat to feed Munich for 5 years. Through Missouri's farmland, the train passed cornfields that stretched beyond the horizon. Every farmhouse possessed electricity, running water, and at least one vehicle. Farmers operated combines that cost more than his father earned in his entire lifetime, yet these were ordinary people, not aristocrats or party members. After 4 days of witnessing American abundance on an almost incomprehensible scale, the train arrived at Camp Hearn, Texas, on July 28, 1943. Built in just 4 months on 840 acres outside the small town of Hearn, the camp would eventually house up to 4,800 German prisoners in conditions that exceeded what most had known as civilians back home. The barracks were wooden structures with electricity, flush toilets, and hot showers. They seemed absolutely palatial compared to the marked field accommodations they had endured. The camp's abundance manifested in ways that seemed deliberately cruel to men whose families faced starvation. Each prisoner received 3,000 to 3,600 calories daily. Meat, vegetables, bread, butter, milk, and coffee appeared in quantities that German civilians, surviving on perhaps 1,000 to 1,250 calories, wouldn't encounter until 1948. Kitchen crews discarded more food each day than entire German villages consumed. Gertner was assigned to the camp's administrative section, where his English abilities proved immediately valuable. What struck him most was how American logistics operated on a scale that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Camp Hearn received shipments every single week, and the quantities were staggering. 40,000 pounds of beef, 20,000 loaves of bread, 15,000 gallons of milk, and countless tons of fresh vegetables arriving with clockwork precision. The prisoners, resourceful and determined, took the surplus materials that Americans simply discarded and built something remarkable. An amphitheater seating 3,000 people rose from scrap wood and concrete. Sports complexes with soccer pitches and swimming pools took shape. Decorative fountains emerged where there had been nothing but waste. These were structures that would have seemed unimaginable in wartime Germany, where materials of any kind were rationed down to practically nothing. By autumn of that same year, labor shortages across America forced a dramatic shift in policy. The government needed workers desperately, and German prisoners became the answer. Gertner's work squad found themselves assigned to cotton farms spreading across the Texas landscape. Each day they traveled out through the countryside without blindfolds, without guards surrounding them at every moment, without the restrictions they might have expected. It was a freedom they'd never anticipated. The first farm belonged to a man named Jim Morrison, someone who owned roughly 2,000 acres just outside Hearn. Morrison met them in worn denim overalls, arriving in a Ford truck that probably cost more than a German factory worker could earn in a lifetime. His equipment told the story of American agriculture. 2 tractors, a combine harvester, mechanical cotton pickers that could accomplish what used to require dozens of human hands. When Gertner expressed his shock at this machinery, Morrison simply smiled and said, "Nobody's special here, Sergeant. You should see what the big operators have got out in California." The small farmers, the ones at the bottom of American society, the black and Mexican workers, they lived better than Gertner could have imagined. Their lunches alone would have seemed like feasts back home. Those sandwiches were enormous, thick with meat and cheese and fresh fruit, accompanied by thermoses of iced tea. These workers owned boots made properly, not patched together. They had bicycles. Some of them had automobiles. They listened to radios. When Gertner mentioned to a black worker named Samuel Washington that this seemed impossible during wartime, the man just laughed and said, "This ain't prosperity, Sergeant. This is just normal life." You should have seen how things were back in the 20s. It shook something loose in Gertner's understanding of the world. At a cotton gin near Calverton, he witnessed mechanical processing that made German agricultural methods look primitive by comparison. A single facility could process more cotton in one day than his entire home province managed in a month. The electricity powering it came from the Rural Electrification Program, something that had brought power out to 90% of Texas farms. It was infrastructure on a scale Germany had never attempted. Then came Christmas 1943, and nothing damaged Nazi racial ideology quite as thoroughly. 500,000 Christmas packages arrived for German prisoners of war, for men who'd been trying to kill American soldiers just months before. Each package held cigarettes, candy, soap, razors, playing cards, hand-knitted socks made by American hands. At Camp Hearn, local Methodist and Baptist churches organized a joint service entirely in German. A choir of Texas women whose sons and husbands were fighting somewhere overseas, sang Silent Night and O Tannenbaum, while German prisoners stood with tears streaming down their faces. Children from Sunday school had drawn Christmas cards, simple drawings with messages. "Jesus loves you. Merry Christmas, Fritz." The Christmas dinner itself was overwhelming. Turkey and ham and stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, ice cream. The quantities seemed designed to feed an entire German battalion for a week. Electric lights decorated the mess halls, tinsel hung everywhere, there were actual Christmas trees. That same day, Gertner helped distribute mail that included Red Cross packages from Germany, and those packages told a different story entirely. The letters came written on torn ledger paper in pencil because ink simply wasn't available. Envelopes were made from newspaper. The stamps bore Hitler's increasingly haggard face. The contrast was silent but deafening. Thick American Christmas cards with colorful printing and cheerful images beside desperate messages on scraps of paper from a homeland falling into chaos. By spring of 1944, over 15,000 German prisoners across Texas camps had enrolled in structured educational programs. Universities cooperated with the Army, providing correspondence courses, lectures, vocational instruction. Professors from the University of Texas came directly to Camp Hearn to teach American history, economics, government. Some of these instructors were Jewish refugees, people who'd escaped Nazi persecution, and they taught without anger, without propaganda. One professor, Ernst Goldschmidt, had gotten out of Heidelberg in 1938. He taught constitutional law to Wehrmacht officers who'd sworn oaths to Hitler, and his refusal to show hatred astounded the students who'd expected retribution. The camp library held 20,000 books in German and English, plus subscriptions to American newspapers and magazines. Prisoners read the New York Times, Time, Life, the Saturday Evening Post. They compared multiple viewpoints on current events, something impossible in Nazi Germany, where every newspaper followed one line. Vocational training used equipment that German trade schools could never access. The auto mechanics shop had actual engines to disassemble, electrical systems to study, diagnostic tools beyond anything available in German technical colleges. Gertner enrolled in accounting courses, studying American business practices that revealed capitalism's true function, so different from Nazi caricatures. Textbooks explained how corporations actually operated, how stocks and bonds worked, how ordinary Americans could invest their savings and build wealth. As summer 1944 arrived, American production reached dizzying heights, and POW labor expanded with it. Gertner's crew was sent to an oil refinery outside Houston, and what he witnessed there explained everything about the war in a way no officer ever could. The refinery processed 100,000 barrels daily, more than all of Romania's oil fields combined, the very fields Germany fought so desperately to control. The facility employed 5,000 workers across 3 shifts, including hundreds of women operating machinery so complex that it required real skill. These workers earned wages exceeding what German factory managers made. They drove their own cars to work. They wore clothing that would have required impossible ration allocations in Germany. At ammunition depots, prisoners unloaded shells in quantities that defied comprehension. A single daily shipment contained more artillery shells than a German division would fire in an entire month. The Houston ship channel handled more tonnage daily than Hamburg, Germany's greatest port, had managed in a week before the war. What devastated him most psychologically was the waste. Americans threw away oil drums instead of cleaning them for reuse. Broken machinery got scrapped rather than repaired. This casual indifference to material waste revealed a surplus so vast that efficiency itself had become optional. Throughout 1944, letters from Germany grew increasingly desperate, their tone shifting darker. Gertner's mother wrote on paper torn from ledgers, using pencil because ink had disappeared entirely. She described surviving on starvation rations while his father's brewery had been destroyed by bombing raids. When D-Day news arrived on June 6th, guards excitedly shared newspaper extras with the prisoners. The invasion's scale became immediately apparent. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave alone. The organizational capability on display rendered German resistance almost comical. By autumn of 1944, even the most fanatical Nazis among the prisoners grew quiet. Letters described cities without water or electricity. They reported old men and boys conscripted into desperate defensive positions. April 1945 brought footage that shattered whatever remained of Nazi loyalty. The army required all prisoners to watch films from liberated concentration camps. Many refused to believe what they saw at first, but the evidence proved overwhelming. Gertner watched hardened veterans weep as they recognized the implications. They'd fought for a regime that committed atrocities beyond imagination, while they sat in American camps eating better than German civilians ever could. VE Day arrived on May 8, 1945, bringing celebration to camps but deep dread to the prisoners. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and maps showed Gertner's home region and hometown now lay behind Soviet lines. The German population faced expulsion or worse. Summer 1945 brought systematic preparation for repatriation, and the prisoners filled with something closer to terror than anticipation. The government announced a policy that seemed calculated to destroy them. All prisoners would return to their exact places of origin, regardless of current political control. For the 35,000 prisoners from territories now occupied by the Soviet Union or transferred to Poland, this meant almost certain death or deportation to Siberia. News filtered into the camps about Operation Kielhal, the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens who'd fought alongside Germany. American and British troops had used violence to force screaming Russians onto ships bound for the Soviet Union, where execution or the Gulag awaited them. Recently repatriated prisoners sent letters confirming the worst fears. Those returned to the Soviet zone faced immediate screening by the NKVD. Former POWs were considered contaminated by Western exposure, suspected of being American spies. Many simply disappeared into labor camps in the Urals or Siberia. For Georg Gertner, the decision crystallized in August 1945 when he received confirmation that Schweidnitz had been transferred to Polish administration. The entire German population faced immediate expulsion. His position in camp administration gave him access to repatriation schedules, and what he learned terrified him. His group was scheduled for shipment to Fort Eustis, Virginia in October, then by Liberty ship to Bremerhaven, finally by train to Silesia into the hands of Soviet or Polish authorities. He studied escape with methodical precision. He observed guard rotations carefully. He memorized train schedules. He saved portions of his POW wages, 80 cents daily, that could be exchanged for cash. He practiced his English accent relentlessly, perfecting an identity as Peter Peterson, a Norwegian immigrant who'd lost his papers. On September 21, 1945, everything aligned perfectly. The Western film San Antonio drew massive attendance, leaving the guard rotation depleted. A new moon provided complete darkness. Gertner had accumulated $25, enough for basic survival. At 8:30 in the evening, as gunfire erupted on the movie screen, Gertner slipped out through the recreation hall's rear exit. Moving in a low crouch, he reached the perimeter fence in 90 seconds. After confirming no patrols approached, he crawled under the fence and sprinted across desert scrub as the freight train approached. The locomotive's headlight appeared around the curve, moving faster than he'd anticipated. He ran parallel to the tracks, grabbed the ladder of a boxcar, and hauled himself aboard while the train was still moving at 15 miles per hour. Inside the empty boxcar, he listened for pursuit sirens that never came. By evening count at 10 o'clock, the train would be 30 miles distant, heading west toward El Paso and freedom. The freight train deposited Gertner in El Paso as dawn broke on September 22nd. At the El Paso YMCA, he rented a room for 50 cents. The desk clerk, a veteran missing his left arm, studied him carefully but said nothing. The reading room contained newspapers revealing the search's intensity. The El Paso Herald-Post reported military police checking trains and bus stations for an escaped German POW. The FBI had been notified. A $50 reward was offered for information. At a second-hand store, Gertner traded his jacket for work clothes, denim overalls, cotton shirt, worn boots that transformed him into one of thousands of migrant laborers. Rather than buying a bus ticket, he joined Mexican laborers waiting for farm trucks recruiting cotton pickers, climbing aboard with dozens of others heading north toward Las Cruces. The cotton fields outside Las Cruces provided perfect cover. Farm owners asked no questions beyond whether someone could work. Payment was cash daily, no documentation required. Gertner picked cotton from sunrise to sunset, earning $3 daily, more than German laborers made in a week. The migrant camp revealed American abundance even at poverty's edge. Workers lived in tents but ate better than German middle class ever could. A traveling merchant set up shop selling everything from canned goods to cigarettes, cold bottles of Coca-Cola sweating in the heat. Even the migrant workers, perpetually on the move, owned radios and guitars. Gertner moved quietly among the Mexican laborers, refining a deception that would sustain him through the years ahead. Peter Peterson was his new identity. A Norwegian who had emigrated before the war, lost his papers in a boarding house fire in California, drifted into agricultural work like countless others. The story was simple, believable, and surrounded by fellow workers who asked no questions, many of them undocumented themselves. 3 months in Las Cruces netted him $200 saved from labor and wages, enough to move forward, enough to try California. He purchased a bus ticket to Fresno, traveling only at night to slip past any checkpoints that might exist. By January 1946, Gertner stood in California's Central Valley, working at Giacomazzi Ranch outside Hanford. The owner, Tony Giacomazzi, was a second-generation Italian-American whose parents had built something substantial through determination and opportunity. He paid fair wages without excessive questions, provided decent housing, and seemed content not to know his workers' backgrounds too thoroughly. Summer 1946 brought urgency. Peter Peterson had to vanish. FBI wanted posters still decorated post offices. Norwegian Americans returning from liberated Norway were becoming more visible, more real. Someone might recognize something, notice something. Gertner chose complete erasure and reconstruction. Dennis F. Wiles became his new name, borrowed from an Arkansas migrant family he'd befriended. This Dennis Wiles had been raised in state institutions from age 7 onward, orphaned, with no family connections to verify or trace. The story was airtight because it was deliberately constructed to contain no verifiable details. Forging documents in post-war America proved simpler than expected. Within months, Dennis F. Wiles existed on paper and in the system, complete with birth certificate, social security card, and driver's license. The machinery of bureaucracy processed his existence without friction. Winter 1947 moved him to California's Sierra Nevada mountains, to Sugar Bowl near Lake Tahoe, where his alpine skiing skills opened doors immediately. Teaching wealthy Americans to navigate ski slopes paid better than anything he'd done since fleeing Camp Deming. $300 monthly, often doubled by tips from satisfied clients. The work was steady, respectable, and provided cover that surpassed his ambitions. Yet the contrast gnawed at him. While he guided students down pristine, groomed slopes, letters through the Red Cross revealed what his family endured. His parents had survived expulsion from Silesia, survived removal, but now inhabited a refugee camp outside Frankfurt. They lived in uncertainty and loss while he taught American society's leisured class to ski. Gertner couldn't reach out to help them, couldn't risk it. Better they believed him dead than alive and unreachable. Better their grief than his capture. At Sugar Bowl, he encountered Mary Patterson, a ski enthusiast from a prosperous San Francisco family. Romance bloomed gradually across shared runs down white slopes as Europe struggled through a brutal 1947 winter. January 13, 1952, transformed Dennis Wiles from obscure ski instructor to something approaching celebrity. The Southern Pacific's luxury train became trapped in a blizzard at Uber Pass, stranding 226 passengers. Gertner, working as an instructor in nearby Norden, joined the rescue mobilized across 3 grueling days. His military mountaineering training became suddenly and unexpectedly valuable. When rescuers finally reached the train on January 16th, Gertner guided civilians to safety through conditions that would have killed them alone. Life magazine photographed the rescue teams. Dennis Wiles appeared in those images, anonymous among the heroes. The profound irony was his alone to carry. His photograph circulated in publications alongside FBI wanted posters seeking his capture, yet no one saw connection. The clean-shaven ski instructor bore no resemblance to the German officer photographed in 1943. In 1954, Gertner pursued warmth and moved to La Jolla, California, where he taught tennis at exclusive clubs. $500 monthly to instruct actors and executives who grew frustrated with wooden rackets' limitations. Gertner experimented with aluminum framing, creating designs that were lighter and stronger than traditional construction. He called it the Dennis racket. He never patented it. Patents required background investigations he couldn't withstand. When others later commercialized aluminum racket designs, Gertner watched rivals profit from concepts he'd pioneered in silence. He'd invented what he couldn't claim. At La Jolla Beach and Tennis Club, he met Jean Clark, a widow managing 2 young children alone. Their relationship developed gradually, built on genuine affection that grew steady rather than passionate. June 15, 1964, brought their wedding in Las Vegas. Dennis F. Wiles married Jean Clark, two individuals making a commitment neither fully understood. Gertner had now lived in America longer than in Germany. The fictional history felt more authentic than genuine memories. Jean accepted his explanation that his parents had died, that institutional upbringing had left him family-less. Her children called him Dad. They never suspected their stepfather had commanded soldiers under Hitler's regime. Hawaii beckoned in 1966. Gertner found work as a construction estimator for military projects. The island's multicultural composition provided perfect concealment. Everyone came from somewhere else. Everyone carried a story of migration and reinvention. By 1984, the weight of sustained deception had become unbearable. Jean suggested a European vacation. Gertner knew the masquerade couldn't continue. A passport would trigger investigations. The structure he'd maintained would collapse under scrutiny. On a humid August evening, Gertner finally spoke truth. He was not Dennis Wiles, but Georg Gertner. Not an orphan, but a son who had abandoned his family. Not a ski instructor escaping institutional poverty, but an escaped prisoner of war. Jean's reaction cycled through disbelief, then anger, then devastation. 20 years of marriage dissolved into fundamental deception. They separated in 1985. Divorce proved impossible without documentation Dennis Wiles couldn't provide, so they remained legally married in a strange limbo. Arnold Kramer's 1979 book had mentioned 7 unaccounted-for POWs, including Georg Gertner. Through intermediaries, Gertner contacted Kramer and proposed telling his story in exchange for negotiated surrender terms. On September 11, 1985, precisely 40 years after his escape, Georg Gertner surrendered on NBC's Today Show. Bryant Gumbel interviewed him as millions watched the final escaped POW end 4 decades of flight. The government responded with bureaucratic confusion. The FBI declared they held no interest in prosecuting a 65-year-old man for a 40-year-old escape. Immigration couldn't determine his status. He wasn't technically an illegal immigrant, since America had brought him into the country. He wasn't deportable either, since Germany as Gertner had known it no longer existed. Legal proceedings stretched across years. In 1990, special legislation granted him permanent resident status. Citizenship came finally in November 2009, when he was 88 years old, standing in Denver. Gertner's final years unfolded quietly in Colorado, in Loveland, living simply. Jean divorced him officially once his legal status resolved. He granted occasional interviews, expressing gratitude for American generosity and regret for the deception it had necessitated. In 2012, Gertner returned to Germany one last time, visiting his sister in Hamburg. The prosperous modern nation bore no resemblance to the destroyed country he'd fled decades before. On January 30, 2013, Georg Gertner died in Loveland, Colorado. His death certificate carried both names, acknowledging the dual identity he'd inhabited for 67 years. Gertner's story transcends individual escape to illuminate larger historical currents. The statistics are revealing. Of 425,171 Axis prisoners held in America, only 2,222 attempted escape. That represents 0.52%. The psychological impact of witnessing American prosperity while knowing Germany's devastation created extraordinary effects. These men experienced an America that Nazi propaganda had declared impossible. A nation conducting global war while maintaining civilian abundance that exceeded pre-war German prosperity. The camp experience produced unexpected transformation. German POWs lived better in American captivity than as free soldiers, receiving triple the caloric intake of German civilians. For most prisoners, this reality created fundamental change in how they understood democracy and capitalism. They returned to Germany as inadvertent ambassadors for democratic values, helping construct the Federal Republic along American models. But for Gertner and others like linguist Kurt Rossmeisel, who escaped from Camp Butner and lived as Frank Ellis for 14 years, the contrast proved too extreme to bridge. The psychological gap was simply too vast. The statistics illuminate America's remarkable success in POW management. Of 371,683 German prisoners held, 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent in post-war surveys. Only 7 prisoners remained permanently unaccounted for, with Gertner the last after Rossmeisel's 1959 surrender. Not a single American civilian died at the hands of escaped German POWs. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners emigrated to America legally after 1950. The contrast with Soviet camps is brutal and clarifying. 3 million German prisoners fell into Soviet hands, and approximately 1 million died in captivity. Survivors weren't released until 1955. American camps became inadvertent classrooms in capitalism, where prisoners learned that reconstruction was possible because they witnessed abundance created through production rather than conquest. Georg Gertner died having lived 2 complete lives. One as a German soldier serving a criminal regime, another as an American citizen embodying immigrant transformation. His escape was motivated by simple human desire for something better, after witnessing American abundance that made returning to Soviet-occupied ruins seem like volunteering for destruction. America's treatment of German POWs represented soft power at its most effective. By treating enemies with dignity and demonstrating democratic values through action rather than propaganda, America converted adversaries into allies and advocates. Yet Gertner's story reveals what transformation costs. Parents died believing him dead. His sister mourned unnecessarily. His wife discovered 4 decades of carefully maintained deception. Freedom carried a price paid by those he left behind. The last German soldier in America died as he had lived for 40 years, as an American. His transformation from officer to retiree encompassed the entire arc of post-war reconciliation. His gravestone carries no mention of his extraordinary history. It stands as quiet testament to prosperity's power to transform enemies into citizens. The German POW, impressed so deeply by American abundance that he risked everything to escape captivity and avoid returning home, had finally found what he sought. Not merely material comfort, but freedom to become someone entirely different. Gertner died as Dennis F. Wiles, having chosen America so completely that America finally chose him. His escape was complete. He had run not just from Camp Deming, but from history itself, discovering refuge in a nation wealthy enough to forget his past and generous enough to grant him a future.